Constitution 101 is does one thing actually. It's what it does is allow the people of the state of Idaho to decide whether they want to change the process in which we present initiatives or referendums on the ballot. So a little background on this. In 2021, the legislature passed overwhelmingly a measure which required signatures from every one of the election districts, 6% of the election 6% of the voting population in the election districts to pass initiatives and referendums. That law was ruled unconstitutional by the Idaho Supreme Court, not because there was anything necessarily wrong with the law. The Idaho Supreme Court simply said it is not something that the legislature can do. It is something that only the people can do. So that's what SJR 101 is about. It is about presenting the people of the state the option to decide whether they want to change the initiative process requiring signatures from all of the election districts rather than from a select few. I ask your approval on this.
For the motions, for the debate on the motion. Gentleman from 16.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to debate the Senate Joint Memorial 101.
Gentleman has the floor to debate the Senate Memorial.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution is where the legislature derives its power. Everything that we do in this body is derived from the consent of the people via that constitutional amendment. It says the legislative power of the state shall be vested in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The very next paragraph is a power that the people reserve for themselves. The people reserve to themselves the power to approve or reject at the polls any act or measure passed by the legislature. This power is known as the referendum, and legal voters may, under such conditions and in such manner as to be provided by acts of the legislature, demand a referendum to vote on any act or measure passed by the legislature and cause the same to be submitted to a vote for the people for their approval or rejection. This constitutional amendment was passed in 1911. I dove into the legislative history on this, and some really interesting politics took place to get this into the Constitution. People in the legislature did not like the idea, but what happened was the people were so vocal in their support for this that the politics kind of shifted on it. They put this into the Constitution, but it wasn't self-enacting. What that means is they followed Utah's example. 10 years prior had put referendum and initiative and recall elections into their constitution, but gave no enacting clause. So what that meant effectively is that for 22 years, the people of Idaho could not use the referendum until 1933, when the legislature finally gave it the ability for them to gather the signatures they needed to get a petition on the ballot. The first time, and one of the only times the referendum has ever been successfully used in the state of Idaho, was 1936, when, in the throes of the Great Depression, the people overturned a 2% sales tax that would have left them even further into poverty. This right has only been used 7 times and only 4 times successfully in the state of Idaho. But it is important check. We all fight against government overreach all the time in different ways. And this is the tool that the people have to check on our power. Now, this bill doesn't expressly do away with the referendum process, but what I'm concerned about is constructively repealing the referendum process in our state. As I mentioned, the referendum has only been used 7 times in our history. We did not impose a distribution requirement, a geographic distribution requirement on the referendum process until the year 2013, after it was successfully used for the second time. to repeal students come first laws that were passed by the legislature. The referendum has never been used with a geographic distribution requirement of 18 out of 35 districts, much less 35 out of 35 legislative districts. If you were to ask me how much it would cost to put together a referendum going to 35 out of 35 legislative districts to get 6% of the signatures across the state, I think that would probably cost in the ballpark of about $10 million. One of the reasons why this right is so rarely used to begin with is because these signatures have to be gathered within 60 days. 60 days to exercise this right, to get 60,000 valid signatures, upward of 100,000 actual signatures statewide in every single legislative district. Think about your legislative district. I've seen a map. I don't know how the good lady and gentleman from District 8 get through their district, but I know that it would be incredibly hard to qualify for something for the ballot requiring signatures from every single legislative district. Additionally, the idea that we would give veto power to any single legislative district in the state, I think is antithetical to this right. The idea that voters in the north end of Idaho could veto anything that residents of the north end of Boise, excuse me, I'm not criticizing North Idaho, I'm criticizing the north end of Boise. Sorry to the good gentleman and lady from District 19. The idea that we would give them veto power over anything that your constituents would want to bring a referendum for, I think is antithetical to this right that's vested in the Constitution. Additionally, I think we deserve to be more honest with our voters. If we want to rein in ballot initiatives or referendums, we should just do that. We should put that to the voters, ask them how they feel about retaining this right, instead of something I believe to be a constructive repeal of the referendum process. Additionally, you have a handout from me that shows how this geographic distribution requirement would square with the other 20 plus states that have a referendum or initiative process. And by my count, it would be the most difficult in the nation. And I want you to think about that from the perspective of another right that we might protect here. If Idaho was the most difficult place to worship, the most difficult place to buy a gun, would we be proud of that? Could we be proud of that? I don't think so. And I think here we have to apply the same lens to the referendum and initiative right. Reasonable minds can disagree about the ballot initiative process and how likely it would be to achieve under this. However, this will effectively end the referendum process in perpetuity should this go to the voters and pass. And if that's going to happen, we need to be more honest with them about the effects of it. I'd rather see a repeal put before the people than actually see what we have today before us in SJR 101. In closing, I'd ask you to defend Idaho's right to stand up to things that we might do. We don't always bat 1,000. I think we do a pretty good job here, but we don't always bat 1,000. And they deserve their rights to check us if and when we get it wrong. I'd appreciate your red light.
Thank you, good gentlemen. It's for debate on motion. Good gentleman, 25.
To debate the motion.
Someone has the floor, debate the vote.
As you leave the garden area, excuse me, as you leave the garden area out into the rotunda, there's one of those placards, and I'm not sure who put them out, maybe the Idaho State Historical Society, but one of them says the voice of the people. And I've stopped and read that on a couple of different occasions. And there's some interesting things came through the initiative and referendum process. Fish and game was instituted by the people, not by the legislature. The homeowners exemption came from the people, not the legislative body. Okay. There's others that went on through there, several of them doing with term limits that we went ahead and overturned, or this good body did, not me. The last two general elections, there have been 3 ballot measures. One passed, one failed, and one, excuse me, one was removed by the organizers, okay? It hasn't been abused in any way, shape, or form. I want to remind you of the words of the Supreme Court when they struck down the law, or the ordinance, or the law that we put forth concerning this, where we changed it to 35 districts. The Supreme Court, in their commentary, said, tyranny of the minority over the majority. This deserves a red light. Thank you.
For debate on the motion, good lady 34.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to debate the memorial.
Lady has the floor to debate it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I was initially open to this idea of putting a vote towards the people to let them have a say. We've been having this discussion in this body for a number of years at this point, and it seemed like it was time to take the question back to the citizens and say, what would you like to do going forward? But then as I dove into the language within this particular memorial, I ran into a bit of a roadblock, because based on how the language is described by the bill sponsors that I heard in the committee discussions, I don't believe the language is acting as intended based on the description. And I want to be clear, I'm not attributing malice or ill intent on the part of the individuals who did the drafting. I think it's just a literal mistake within the language that's resulting in a execution of the initiative process that runs counter to what was described. So as many of you probably heard, the description, something went along the lines of 6% of all votes cast in the last general election in each of the 35 legislative districts. But as it reads in the legislation, it's just 5 lines. So if you'll follow along with me, I'm reading on lines 31 to 35. It says, before any referendum petition or initiative petition may be submitted to the vote of the people, there must be affixed thereto the signatures of legal voters from each legislative district, equal in number to at least 6% of the legal voters at the time of the last general election. Now, when I read legal voters, I think you can end up with 2 interpretations, and that's where it creates the conflict. A legal voter also could be defined as an individual who is registered to vote, because we talk in other sections of code about qualified electors and legal voters, and these are interchangeable terms. And so I would argue that the way that this language is presented within the memorial, it creates a threshold much higher than I think was intended by the bill sponsors. So instead of roughly 50 some odd thousand votes being collected in the state, double that would need to be collected to reflect the total number of registered voters in the state, which at the time of the 2022 general election was just over 1 million. So I stand before you today as a concerned member of this body, putting forward a question that has been discussed in prior debates on other bills. The language matters, and I believe the language in this legislation is flawed despite the intentions of those who put it forward. As I indicated, I do not believe this is ill will or anything on the part of the individuals who drafted it. It's simply a mistake. And if we are going to put something on the ballot and ask the citizens of this state to vote on an amendment to our Constitution, to then have it be binding on the state, I believe the language should be as accurate as possible. And in this instance, this language does not reflect the intent that I have heard expressed for this particular change. I encourage your red light.
Hey, good ladies, for debate on the motion. Gentleman from 1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to debate against 101.
Gentleman has the floor to debate.
Since my district was mentioned in North Idaho from the, I'll bring it up anyway. I've had an overwhelming number of calls and emails suggesting that I red light this 101. Most of those have said that they'll lose their voice. I recognize that there's a different way to look at this as well, and there's some confusion about it, but just to clarify for my own district, it's been overwhelming that we red light this. The people that have contacted me have all said it really takes away their freedoms, and I'm not willing to vote against that. I appreciate your help.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the debate on the motion. Gentleman 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to vote in, or to debate in favor of the bill.
Gentleman has the floor to debate.
I'd like to speak to something that I keep hearing here about the good representative from District 1 and the good representative from District 16 about this somehow limiting a voice, or somehow the people in North Idaho could veto something. Right now, as you travel south from the northern border, you travel 2/3 of the state before you get through District 7. That means the rest of the districts, 28 of them, are in the south part of the state. I would say that this gives a voice to all of the state. For somebody in District 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 thinking their voice would be limited, I would contend that this would be the time that they would get a say. Because right now, these actions can be carried out without ever leaving the southern part of the state. So this is entirely controlled by the southern part of the state. And whether or not it would cost more money or not, I know that it might be more laborsome for outside sources to come in and inflict us with their ideals. But when these are homegrown Idaho people that want to do homegrown Idaho things, they know how to get things done in their own legislative districts. I do not think that this is too much of a hill to climb for anyone. That's why I'm in favor of this, because I think it gives a voice spread out through the entirety of the state. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentlemen, for the debate on the motion. Hearing none. The lady from 18.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To debate the bill?
The lady has the floor to debate the bill.
Thank you. Just want to underscore and address a few things here. I'm really glad that the good lady raised up the question of the drafting error. I want to highlight for you, I went back and listened to the hearings. There is a very fundamental disconnect, I think, between what was said in committee about what this bill does and what this bill's language says it does. The sponsor on repeated occasions in committee said that the intent of this bill was that it was only going to be a 6% of the votes cast. But I don't think there's really much ambiguity in the language that it says the percentage of registered votes. That's how I believe that would be read. So I don't know if that was intended, but there's a major disconnect there. And as the good lady noted, it's a disconnect that results in doubling the difficulty of ever certifying another ballot or initiative. So this is a very serious drafting error. Beyond that, I want to address a couple things that I've heard here and have heard over the years. One that we just heard was the idea, oh, this is great, it gives everybody a voice. And I've heard in the past, oh, this will protect rural districts. This way rural districts will be heard. Well, I put it to you, what if we said that bills could only pass here if it had the votes of legislators or senators from all 35 districts? Would you all think, what a fantastic way to protect rural voters? Or would you say, wow, that's a way to grind the legislative process to a total halt? I think you'd think the latter. Now, of course, it'd be great for my district. We'd have a lot more say than we have right now if my district had total veto power over anything that could go through this body. But I don't know that that would serve the state of Idaho to give any single one district total veto power over the process, which is where this would put us. But I want to say we are already at the outer bounds of feasibility. And having worked on certifying initiatives in the past, I worked on the Medicaid Expansion one. That was the biggest volunteer effort in state history. Thousands of people out there. People were out there on crutches. People in chemotherapy who could barely walk were staggering out to farmers markets to collect signatures because they were so desperate. The legislature had refused to vote on it for 6 years. There was huge backlogged energy, off the charts participation in every corner of the state, rural, urban, you name it. That one barely certified under the current standards. By the week before, people really weren't sure whether it was actually going to make it on the ballot. I'm telling you, there is zero chance that these things get on the ballot in the future under a 35 district requirement. We're not giving people a voice, we are completely eradicating the voice. And don't take my word for it, this did go to the Idaho Supreme Court. And the reason it was struck down is because that's the conclusion the justices came to, was that under this standard, precisely this standard went to the Supreme Court. Because the legislature attempted it by statute a couple years ago. And they said, this would make it unworkable. This would wipe out the fundamental right to ballot initiatives. This was extensively litigated. Lots of evidence was presented on both sides. And the Supreme Court unanimously concluded that this shut down the initiative and referendum process. And so I do think that we should be honest with voters. If that's what you're trying to do, put that on the ballot. Ask them, do you want to give up your fundamental right to ballot initiatives and referenda, as opposed to dressing it up in this 35 district language. This is, let there be no mistake, the eradication of it. And I think that's a very bad idea for a number of reasons. Because first of all, let's talk about rural Idaho. Now, many of you hate Medicaid expansion, I'm sure, but you can't really make the case. The people who benefited most were rural Idahoans. I mean, it's their hospitals that were saved. That passed in Camas County and Lemhi and Payette and Boise County and Gooding and Caribou and Clearwater and Butte and Gem and Bingham County and Minidoka. It passed overwhelmingly in the rural parts of the state. But this is, again, we are at the outer bounds, and we don't need to make it harder. We're not California. People aren't walking into their ballot and seeing 25 ballot initiatives on there. We, the legislators, I hear we're a republic, we're not a democracy. Okay, we, the legislators, pass about 500 bills a year. The people of Idaho pass about 1 bill every 8 years. This is not a situation that's getting out of control, folks. It's incredibly rare. It's used very judiciously. It's been used, as was noted, on things like sunshine laws for election donations and the Department of Fish and Game and homeowners exemptions. I know that some have fears, which I think are not particularly grounded about, like, oh no, if we let people have ballot initiative rights, they might someday legalize marijuana. Let me tell you, there's been efforts afoot for about a decade. I don't think that thing has ever come close to 5% of the signatures that's needed. Under our current standard, it is so darn hard to get on the ballot that only things that have massive public support across the state, urban and rural, have any shot. So I don't think you have to worry about some of the things you hear about, whether there's going to be some anti-agriculture thing. Nothing has ever even been proposed along those lines, and it would have zero chance under our current standards. I don't think this is a basis to eradicate ballot initiative rights. But the other thing is, I think we got to be cautious about our own hubris in here. I know we're all super fabulous and think that we do the best job imaginable for the people, and much of the time we do. But this is it. This is the only thing the people have to break the emergency glass when we are not doing what they want, what they desperately want, what a very large number of them desperately want. This is all they've got. And it's really hard already, and I don't think we should take it away. And beyond that, I've heard the argument of, well, let's just see what happens. What's the harm of putting it in front of the people? Well, I think there's substantial harm there, because it's going to be the people are going to have to work really hard. If this gets on the ballot, they're going to have to raise all kinds of money. They're going to have to knock doors. They're going to have to work really hard just to make sure they hang on to a fundamental right they've had for over 100 years. I don't think that's doing the people of Idaho a service to have to bend over backwards and kill themselves to just preserve their existing rights. We wouldn't do that to them on anything else. We wouldn't say, we're going to put on the ballot whether you want to strip away your gun-owning rights, whether you want to strip away your religious rights, and here, go raise $1 million and go door to door for a year if you want to save those rights. I think that's a real disservice to the people. They should not have to work that hard to just keep what they've had for over 100 years. Now, to be clear, I don't think it will pass. This has been polled in the past. 80% of Idahoans oppose any moves to make the ballot initiative more restrictive, including 68% of Republicans oppose any move to make it more restrictive. So I do believe in the end it would fail, but I think it would inflict great harm and unnecessary work on the people of Idaho. So for all of these reasons, I would urge you to give this your red light today.
Thank you, good ladies. Further debate on the motion. The gentleman from 25 with the awesome tobacco tie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a nice tie. I'll get rid of it as soon as I can.
Probably tomorrow.
If I can find somebody that hasn't already worn it this year. I'd like to debate the motion.
Gentleman has the floor to debate the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to say that I think 6% from every legislative district is a legitimate request. I think that there are a lot of rural parts of the state that are left out of the petition process. During the last couple of major petitions, Twin Falls didn't even gain 6%, and we're one of the larger populations, not the biggest, but we're one of the larger population centers. That's troublesome to me to think that there are legislative districts that are concentrated in specific counties, population centers, and the effort to gather these petitions. They don't have to drive too far to gather up a lot of these signatures. With that said, I think money influences these issues. Money influences, they hire petition gatherers. And I have personally experienced walking down the street and having someone walk up to me and ask me to sign a petition. And one of them was on the Medicaid Expansion, and the person started talking to me and a couple of other people around. And I said a couple things to him. I says, you know, what you're saying isn't true. You know, maybe I have more experience and more knowledge, but what you're saying as a petition gatherer is not true. And so that's what they told me to say.
Not true.
So people usually don't see the actual bill that's being proposed on a petition. Now, I'm not proposing we do away with that aspect of things, but it's not a perfect system. Secondly, I want to point out that I was in line during the last petition gathering effort that had to do with funding for the education. And I was with a group of around 10, 12 people from my family, immediate family and friends. And I was towards the front of the line. I had volunteered to buy everybody's tickets into an event, and so had to be up there at the front. And I heard a petition gatherer who I knew personally from the Magic Valley that was standing and saw somebody in our group at the end start talking to them about the petition. And I heard them saying things that were glorifying aspects of the bill and not what the true content of the bill is. In other words, they're not saying, here's the bill, read it, sign this petition. They're just giving them the highlights that they want them to hear. And I immediately ran back and said, you know, you're not telling them the whole truth about what this petition will do. And it was like hemming and hawing, and when they realized who I was, and she also knew me, she kind of backed off a little bit.
Yeah, well.
The other thing about petitions and these initiative process and referendums, they're greatly influenced by money. We talked about this, about an advisory vote earlier. I mean, if I may reference, well, I don't know if it's still pending, but previous legislation, pending legislation, Mr. Speaker.
Unanimous consent has been requested. Is there objection?
Yeah. So,
Refer to it.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did mention previously in discussions when we were talking about an advisory vote, how they can be influenced by special interest groups that can spend hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to influence the outcome of an event. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be allowed to do that, but I'm saying that that does taint a little bit the results of some of these things. But finally, what I want to say is, and some of you are going to be disappointed, some won't. Every time you vote, somebody is. But I think a constitutional amendment should be perfect as we can make it. And I think the wording of this proposed amendment is flawed. And I believe that we can get it right, and we have time before the next general election to get it right. Either in the next session, I doubt we have time, although I'm finding out every day new bills are coming forward, but I believe we can get this right in January in time for the next election. And whether or not it's 6% of registered voters or 6% of the voters in the last election, we need to make sure we get it right, because we know that what is the 6% of the registered voters? You know, as of the last election, when we're asking our county clerks to go through and purge out people that were on a list that weren't technically eligible, but they were on a list at the last election. I think that's a problem we have to deal with. But with the statement that I think that was more eloquently described by the good lady from 34, I can't support this specific constitutional amendment, although I think it has a lot of merit, and I will support one if we can get the wording right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm giving it a red light.
Thank you, good job. First debate on the motion. Late before.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to debate the bill.
Lay has the floor to debate the bill.
I just want to point out that if you look further up in the resolution, on line 19, it says power is known as the referendum and legal voters may. And on line 16, it says and legal voters may. They're using the same language. So it's already in this. They're using the same language.
Thank you, ladies. Further debate on the motion. Gentleman 22.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to debate in favor of the bill.
Gentleman has the floor to debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good ladies and gentlemen. I find it odd that those arguing against this bill are saying we're taking away voter rights. Actually, we're putting it on the ballot, the same as you would put an initiative on the ballot. And we're asking the people, what do you think? We are actually increasing their representation. Just because it's something you don't like is not the reason to keep it off the ballot. We are asking the voters whether they want to have equal representation in all of their districts. We have 2 representatives from every district. We have 1 senator from every district. We have equal representation of each district in this body and in the body across.
You've been in there, what,
And we are
16
asking
years?
the voters, do they
Because you
want that
repealed
same
voter,
type of representation
term
when we
limits?
create
I mean,
an initiative?
Term limits of 8 years?
And all the
Mr.
people say,
Vanderwood,
well, you know, we're taking
you've
away
been in
voting.
there a
No, we're not.
long
We're actually
time.
asking the voters what they want. If they say no, then we know that's not what they
You
want.
need to retire.
Same as we asked for Medicaid expansion. You asked the voters what they wanted, and they said that's what they wanted. This is what we're asking again. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get the voters a chance to decide whether they want equal representation going on ballot initiatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good gentleman. Good lady
You
from
betcha.
6. Would you like to debate the bill? All right. Does anybody like to debate the bill? Anybody else? Hearing none. The gentleman before carried close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So let me address a couple of points here. First of all, to go back to the language is consistent and it is exactly as intended. And the language is suggested by the Attorney General's office. There's no problem with the language. It's exactly what's being looked for. And I will also say that I find myself once again oddly in partial agreement with the gentleman from 16 about the flaws in the initiative process. The federal Constitution does not allow for initiatives. In fact, there are only 24 states that use initiatives. And the current initiative process is flawed. And it's flawed because it represents the ability to have the tyranny of the minority. And that is what we're seeing as a real possibility with the initiative process as it exists. What you can do, and the Medicaid expansion was a very good example of this. Because what happened with the Medicaid expansion, and I know because I was involved in this from the standpoint of a supplier of petition gatherers. I worked for an agency that hired people to gather petitions. And they targeted 3 counties. Guess which 3 counties they targeted? They targeted Ada, Canyon, and Kootenai counties. And they paid people $16 an hour to go out and get those initiatives signed. And that's why we have Medicaid expansion. Simple as that. That is tyranny of the minority. What this measure does, what SJR 101 does, is it asks for representation of the entire state, all 35 districts. And all we're asking for, this is very simple, is to put it in front of the people and see if they want to do that. I can't think of a better representation of what our republic is supposed to be than to go ahead and ask the people what they want. I ask for your green light.
The intent is to repeal citizens' initiatives entirely.
Debate is closed. Question is to Senate Joint Resolution number 101 is amended, pass the House.
You want to suppress the vote.
This is a constitutional amendment, and so it will require 47 votes, 2/3 of the body, or 47 votes to pass. Clerk will unlock machines, members cast their votes.
God, look at that. Good.
Has every member voted? Wheeler. Dixon, 1. Dixon, 1. Does any member wish to change their vote? Clerk will lock the machine and record the roll.
Thank you.
39 ayes, 31 nays, less than 2/3 of the body having voted in favor of Senate Joint Resolution number 101 as amended. Senate Joint Resolution 101 has failed to pass the House and will return to the Senate.